The Fire Within the Atom, a chronicle of power, destruction, and redemption. The discovery began as quiet curiosity in small laboratories and university halls, men and women bending over glassware and instruments, curious about the innards of the atom. What looked, from a distance, like endless minutiae of spectra and decay curves hid a startling truth. Deep inside certain atomic nuclei lay forces so concentrated that, should the nucleus be split, an amount of energy far larger than any chemical reaction could be released. That truth moved from textbook footnote to world-shaking possibility in the 1930s, as experiments peeled back the atom's last veils and showed that matter could yield energy on scales previously imagined only in fiction. At a high level, the physics is simple and terrible. Some heavy nuclei, uranium, plutonium, and their kin, are unstable enough that if one nucleus splits, a process called fission, it can fling off neutrons that strike more nuclei and make them split too. Like a line of falling dominoes, that self-sustaining chain reaction can release enormous energy in an instant. There is also a separate family of reactions, fusion, where like nuclei are forced together under enormous pressure and temperature, briefly forming heavier nuclei and releasing energy because the mass of the result is a hair less than the sum of its parts. Both fission and fusion convert tiny amounts of mass into vast quantities of energy, following the counterintuitive arithmetic of E equals mc squared. The atom's mass difference becomes a prodigious coinage of energy. The path from laboratory curiosity to weapon was not a straight line but a knot of science, fear, and geopolitics. The theoretical possibilities were recognized by many physicists. Some saw peaceful potential, power stations and new instruments, while others, in the shadow of growing authoritarianism in Europe, saw grave danger. As concerns about Nazi Germany's scientific investments grew, so did anxiety among émigré scientists and concerned colleagues in Britain and the United States. Warnings were sent and petitions signed. The most famous of these was a letter drafted by physicists and delivered to political leaders, an urgent missive saying bluntly that the world might soon be able to produce explosives of unprecedented power. That warning launched one of the largest and most secret scientific mobilizations in history. Laboratories were consolidated and swollen into projects. Theoretical physicists, chemists, metallurgists, engineers, and a vast support staff were pulled into a single, intense effort. For many of the scientists, the work was a collision of conscience and craft. The exhilaration of probing fundamental questions of matter met the dread of creating a weapon that could end cities. Offices and workshop floors filled with hurried calculations and prototype testing, but the practicalities were kept intentionally vague in public. The language used was often euphemistic, the sites were remote, and the work proceeded under layers of compartmentalization. The first true test of that clandestine effort came in a desert bowl just before dawn. The test, an instrumented, terrifying experiment, produced a blast unlike anything the human race had observed, a towering fireball, a shock wave that bent the horizon, and a light that turned midnight into a harsh, bleached morning for those who watched. The scientists who had labored for years stood in a strange numbness afterward. Some cheered, some wept, and many simply stared, unable to reconcile the elegant equations they loved with the monstrous, immediate reality now visible in the landscape. News of the new weapon's catastrophic potential spread quickly and irrevocably changed the perception of war. Within weeks, nuclear weapons, previously an abstract worry, had been used in conflict, shattering two cities and demonstrating both the strategic potency and the moral horror of the new era. The human cost was appalling and immediate. The cultural, ethical, and political reverberations would last generations. Overnight, the calculus of national security, diplomacy, and deterrence shifted. the scale of possible destruction made the old rules of warfare seem both quaint and dangerously inadequate. Even as nations hurried to master or counter the technology, scientists everywhere found themselves weighing the uses of their discoveries. Some embraced stewardship, pushing for control, transparency, and restrictions, while others doubled down on research, rationalizing that knowledge, once found, must be understood and guarded. Conventions and treaties would later attempt to put limits on the proliferation and testing of such weapons, born from a shared, if uneasy, recognition that humanity had crossed a threshold it could not uncross. By the close of that first chapter, the world had been forced to accept an uncomfortable paradox. The same physics that promised boundless energy and deeper understanding of the universe also made possible a scale of violence that could annihilate whole civilizations. The atom, once an object of pure scientific curiosity, had become a political and moral fulcrum, the place where theory met fate, where laboratories and leadership were bound together by a single, terrible capability. The summer of 1945 hung heavy with exhaustion. Years of war had scarred nearly every continent, and the Pacific theater was grinding toward its bloody end. Japan, though battered and blockaded, refused unconditional surrender. Every plan for invasion projected catastrophic losses on both sides. In secret rooms thousands of miles away, leaders weighed the unimaginable. To end the war with a single act that could crush resistance but at a cost beyond comprehension. The decision. The Manhattan Project had delivered 2 working bombs, different designs born of frantic innovation. One, codenamed Little Boy, used uranium-235, the other, Fat Man, used plutonium-239 and an implosion mechanism far more intricate. Scientists debated demonstration versus direct use, but the decision ultimately rested with political and military leaders. They believed that a shocking display might end the war swiftly, before further invasion or Soviet expansion. In late July, the order was signed: drop the weapons on Japan if the nation did not surrender. Hiroshima. At 8:15 a.m. on August 6, 1945, the B-29 Enola Gay released Little Boy over Hiroshima. 43 seconds later, the weapon detonated roughly 1,900 feet above the city. A blinding flash illuminated the morning, an instant brighter than 1,000 suns. The temperature at the hypocenter soared above 3,000 degrees Celsius, 5,400 degrees Fahrenheit. Buildings within a mile were vaporized, shadows of railings and people seared onto concrete, and a pressure wave flattened nearly everything in its path. Within seconds, tens of thousands of people were gone. Fires erupted across the ruins, merging into a citywide inferno. In the following days, many more died from burns, trauma, and radiation sickness, an invisible scourge that physicians barely understood. Skin sloughed away, hair fell out, and fevers raged. Survivors, later known as hibakusha, carried the physical and psychological scars for life. Nagasaki. 3 days later, on August 9, the second bomb, Fat Man, fell on Nagasaki. Weather and chance diverted it from its original target, and the mountainous terrain spared part of the city from total destruction. Even so, the blast leveled the Urakami Valley, annihilating homes, factories, and a cathedral that had stood for centuries. Approximately 40,000 people died instantly, many more followed from radiation exposure and injuries. By August 15, Japan announced its surrender. The war was over, but the images of flattened cities, charred bodies, and ghostly silhouettes burned into stone haunted humanity's conscience forever. The consequences. The bombings introduced the world to a new terror, a single device that could erase a city. Scientists who had once worked proudly on the project found themselves questioning their roles. Some, like J. Robert Oppenheimer, spoke of blood on their hands and quoted from ancient texts about becoming the destroyer of worlds. Others justified the act as the tragic arithmetic of ending war faster. Yet the moral wound ran deep, sparking decades of debate, denial, and reflection. The geopolitical order shifted overnight. Nations scrambled to develop their own nuclear arsenals. What began as a race for survival became a contest of deterrence, an uneasy equilibrium built on fear. Treaties, stockpiles, and doctrines such as mutually assured destruction, MAD, defined the Cold War landscape. The age of the atom had dawned, not with enlightenment, but with fire. Hiroshima and Nagasaki today. Decades later, both cities stand transformed, rebuilt from ashes into symbols of resilience and peace. Hiroshima's Peace Memorial Park now spreads across the once flattened center, anchored by the skeletal dome of the former Industrial Promotion Hall, preserved as the A-bomb dome. Its shattered shell, silhouetted against the skyline, reminds visitors of both destruction and endurance. Each August, lanterns float down the Motoyasu River in quiet remembrance, their reflections trembling in the water like spirits returning home. Nagasaki, too, bears its scars with grace. The Urakami Cathedral has been reconstructed. Nearby, the Peace Park and Atomic Bomb Museum stand as testaments to memory. Sculptures and fountains commemorate those who perished, and each year, the city's mayor delivers a plea to the world for nuclear disarmament. Both places hum with life, children laughing, trains gliding past, the ordinary rhythm of peace restored. Yet under the modern streets lie fragments of fused earth and bone still mingled with the soil, a silent record of that August morning. Where once there was only dust and sorrow, there now stands a collective vow, never again. When the fires of Hiroshima and Nagasaki dimmed, the world entered a new and uneasy light, one not of victory, but of vigilance. The atom had proven its capacity for annihilation, and now, amid the ruins of war, nations began to fear not what others might do, but what they themselves had unleashed. The bomb was both a weapon and a warning, and the dawn of peace quickly gave way to a colder, more calculated conflict, the Cold War. The divided world. In the years following World War II, two superpowers emerged from the wreckage with competing visions of the future, the United States and the Soviet Union. Both had fought side by side against fascism, yet their alliance was born of necessity, not trust. Once the common enemy was gone, ideological differences widened into suspicion and fear. The bomb, America's ultimate trump card, was initially seen as a guarantee of dominance. But secrets in the nuclear age had short half-lives. By 1949, the Soviet Union detonated its own atomic bomb, shocking the West. The world realized, almost overnight, that the monopoly on nuclear power was gone. Scientists and strategists raced to redefine deterrence, knowing that any conflict between the two nations could end in mutual ruin. The atomic arms race had begun, driven not by necessity but by the desperate logic of if we do not, they will. A new frontier of destruction. In the wake of the Soviet test, physicists in the United States began to push the boundaries of what was scientifically and morally possible. If fission could destroy a city, fusion could destroy a nation. The concept was simple but staggering. Use the heat and pressure of a fission bomb to ignite fusion, the same reaction that powers the sun. This would yield an explosion not thousands, but millions of tons of TNT equivalent. Edward Teller, often called the father of the hydrogen bomb, championed the idea with almost prophetic zeal. Others, like Oppenheimer, opposed it, calling it a step toward genocide. The moral debates were fierce and bitter, splitting the scientific community. But geopolitical anxiety silenced doubt. In 1952, the United States tested the first thermonuclear device, Ivy Mike, on the remote Enuetic Atoll in the Pacific. The blast vaporized an island and left a crater over a mile wide. The mushroom cloud soared 30 miles into the atmosphere, dwarfing anything seen before. It was no longer just the energy of splitting atoms, it was the fire of creation itself, pulled down from the heavens and trapped in human hands. Less than a year later, the Soviet Union responded with its own hydrogen bomb. Soon, both sides began stockpiling warheads measured not in hundreds but in tens of thousands. The race for supremacy turned into a race toward the brink of extinction. The science of the sun. A hydrogen bomb, or thermonuclear weapon, is a marvel of engineering and terror. It combines two stages, a fission primary and a fusion secondary. The first stage, a small atomic bomb, creates extreme heat and radiation that compresses and ignites the second. Inside that second stage, isotopes of hydrogen, deuterium and tritium, fuse together to form helium, releasing vast amounts of energy. To confine the reaction, designers use heavy elements like uranium or lead as tamper materials, reflecting the blast inward for microseconds to maintain the incredible pressure required. Each stage triggers the next in a cascade of controlled chaos. The result is energy released in millionths of a second, temperatures hotter than the core of the sun, and shockwaves that can flatten everything for miles. Unlike the first atomic bombs, which were crude prototypes of destruction, the hydrogen bomb was precision apocalypse, a weapon so powerful that no city, no civilization, could ever hope to survive its full fury. Mutually assured destruction. As nuclear arsenals grew, a strange paradox emerged: the more weapons a nation possessed, the less likely it was to use them. Both the US and the Soviet Union adopted the doctrine of mutually assured destruction, MAD, a grim equilibrium based on the understanding that any nuclear strike would guarantee total retaliation. The balance of power became a balance of terror. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, the world teetered on the knife edge of annihilation. Civil defense films taught children to duck and cover, as if a desk could save them from a fireball. Fallout shelters were stocked with canned food and filtered air. The public lived under a sky that could, at any hour, turn to light. And yet, in this perilous stalemate, humanity made its first steps into space, developed vaccines, and connected the world through communication networks, all under the same nuclear sword. The very fear of destruction became an unlikely engine of progress, driving scientific innovation even as it shadowed every advance with existential dread. A legacy in the sand. Many of the test sites of that era still bear their scars. In Nevada, the desert remains pocked with craters, mute reminders of atomic fire. On Pacific atolls, lagoons glow faintly where coral was vaporized and glacified by blast waves. The air and soil, decades later, still whisper traces of radiation. Yet out of those wastelands, life has returned, fish swim again in the lagoons, and wildflowers grow over test craters. Nature, indifferent and patient, has reclaimed the places where mankind once practiced its own destruction. The Cold War was more than a rivalry of nations, it was a battle between reason and fear, between progress and self-destruction. The bomb, born of intellect, became the greatest test of morality in human history. And though the decades that followed would see treaties, disarmament efforts, and temporary calm, one truth remained: knowledge cannot be unlearned. The fire of the atom, once kindled, will forever smolder in the shadow of human ambition. The 1960s dawned with uneasy confidence. Both the United States and the Soviet Union had tested hundreds of nuclear devices, refining their weapons and delivery systems, missiles that could reach across oceans, submarines that could fire from beneath the waves, and bombers that could circle the globe. Deterrence had become a dangerous kind of faith, peace by fear. Yet faith is fragile, and in October 1962, the world discovered just how thin the line between civilization and annihilation truly was. A dangerous game of chess. It began with reconnaissance photographs, grainy black and white images captured by American U-2 spy planes over Cuba. Deep in the jungles and sugarcane fields, analysts identified long, rectangular shapes and cylindrical objects resting on launch pads. They were unmistakable: Soviet medium-range ballistic missiles, capable of delivering nuclear warheads to nearly every major U.S. city east of the Mississippi. The revelation shocked the Kennedy administration. For years, the United States had stationed its own nuclear missiles in Turkey and Italy, close to Soviet borders. Now, the Soviets had matched that move, bringing the Cold War to America's doorstep. President John F. Kennedy convened his closest advisers, forming the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, ExComm, a secret group that would wrestle for 13 tense days with the fate of the world. Every option was on the table: invasion, airstrikes, negotiation, or blockade. Each carried the risk of war. In Moscow, Premier Nikita Khrushchev saw the missiles as both protection for Cuba and leverage against U.S. aggression. To him, the deployment was a logical counterbalance. To Kennedy, it was an intolerable threat. The standoff. On October 22, Kennedy addressed the nation on live television. His calm, deliberate voice concealed the gravity of the situation. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. He announced a naval quarantine, a blockade in all but name, around Cuba to prevent further Soviet shipments. American warships moved into position, Soviet freighters steamed toward the line. Every hour brought the possibility of the first nuclear confrontation in history. In the tense days that followed, the world held its breath. Families built fallout shelters. Children were sent home from school. Across Europe, bombers were fueled and loaded, radar screens flickered with blips that could mean death. One misstep, one misinterpreted order, could ignite the end. Then came the near misses. On October 27, a US U-2 was shot down over Cuba, killing its pilot. American generals clamored for retaliation, but Kennedy held back, fearing escalation. At the same time, another U-2 accidentally strayed over Soviet airspace near Alaska, nearly triggering a counterattack. Deep below the Atlantic, a Soviet submarine, B-59, was cornered by American destroyers dropping practice depth charges. The sub's crew, cut off from Moscow, believed war had already begun. The captain ordered a nuclear torpedo prepared. It was only the dissent of one man, Vasily Arkhipov, the second in command, that stopped him from launching. His refusal may have saved the world. The resolution. On October 28, a breakthrough arrived. Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba in exchange for a U.S. pledge not to invade the island, and, secretly, the removal of American Jupiter missiles from Turkey. The crisis ended not with war, but with compromise. Behind the scenes, both leaders understood how close they had come. Kennedy later confided to an aide, "It is insane that two men, sitting on opposite sides of the world, should be able to decide to bring an end to civilization." In the following months, a direct hotline was established between Washington and Moscow, a red telephone to allow instant communication in moments of crisis. It became a symbol of sanity in an age of madness. Lessons in shadows. The Cuban Missile Crisis changed everything. It showed that nuclear war could begin not from malice, but from miscalculation. It also revealed that restraint, not aggression, was the truest form of strength. Both nations began to pursue limited arms control. The Partial Test Ban Treaty of 1963 banned nuclear tests in the atmosphere, underwater, and in space, curbing the radioactive fallout that had poisoned skies and seas for over a decade. Yet the arms race continued, more quietly but no less dangerously. Missiles grew faster, silos deeper, submarines stealthier. Each side designed fail-safes to prevent accidental launches, while knowing that no system could ever be truly fail-safe. Humanity had escaped the brink once, but the abyss was still there, just beneath the surface. Echoes of the brink. Today, archives and declassified documents reveal just how close the world came to annihilation during those 13 days. Calculations show that a single full exchange between the US and USSR would have killed hundreds of millions instantly, with billions more perishing from radiation and nuclear winter. The Earth itself would have grown dim beneath clouds of soot, the sun veiled by the fires of its own creations. The Cuban Missile Crisis became a ghost story told to generations of leaders, a warning whispered across time. It was proof that reason could triumph over fear, but also a reminder that civilization's survival often hinges on fragile threads of human judgment. As historians later wrote, the world was one telegram away from the end. The 1960s ended not with the crack of war, but with the quiet hum of fear. Humanity had stared into the nuclear abyss and blinked. But peace, as it turned out, was not the absence of bombs, it was the management of them. The age that followed was defined by the paradox of control. The world's most destructive weapons became the instruments of stability, their mere existence keeping war at bay. The spread of the atom. In the years following the Cuban Missile Crisis, the nuclear club began to grow. What had once been the secret domain of two superpowers soon attracted others. The United Kingdom and France developed their own arsenals, determined not to rely on American promises of protection. China tested its first atomic bomb in 1964, declaring that the East wind prevails over the West. Each new entrant to the nuclear circle made the world a little less predictable. Intelligence agencies scrambled to track fissile material. Scientists and diplomats spoke in careful language, uranium enrichment, reactor grade versus weapons grade, as the boundary between energy and armament blurred. The fear was no longer only of war between giants, but of what might happen if smaller nations, unstable governments, or rogue actors acquired the fire of the atom. Israel, India, and Pakistan each took their own path toward the bomb, motivated by survival and rivalry. North Korea's ambition simmered in secrecy for decades. The spread of nuclear technology became a race between progress and peril, as the same reactors that could light cities could also breed plutonium. The Non-Proliferation Treaty. By the mid-1960s, it became clear that unrestrained proliferation would eventually lead to catastrophe. In 1968, the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, NPT, was signed, a diplomatic effort to hold back the tide. The agreement rested on three pillars. Non-proliferation: nations without nuclear weapons agreed not to develop them. Disarmament: those with nuclear weapons pledged to pursue reduction. Peaceful use: all nations retained the right to pursue nuclear energy for development. It was a fragile balance of trust and verification. Inspectors from the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, were tasked with ensuring compliance, wandering through reactor halls with Geiger counters and clipboards. Yet even as the treaty sought to limit spread, the major powers continued refining their arsenals, testing new warheads underground, fitting missiles with multiple independently targetable reentry vehicles, MIRVs, and developing submarines that could vanish beneath the waves for months. The NPT slowed proliferation, but it did not stop it. The promise of disarmament was rarely kept, and the nuclear powers justified their stockpiles as necessary deterrents in an uncertain world. "We keep the peace by preparing for war," leaders would say. And so, the paradox deepened. Detente and shadows. The 1970s ushered in a cautious thaw known as détente. The United States and the Soviet Union signed arms limitation agreements, SALT I and SALT II, seeking to cap the number of strategic missiles. The goal was to control the arms race, not end it. Nuclear diplomacy became a careful dance of mathematics and mistrust: how many warheads equaled deterrence, and how many invited destruction. Behind the scenes, the superpowers continued to modernize their weapons. Submarines prowled silently under the polar ice, each carrying enough destructive power to erase continents. Command centers were buried deep in mountains. Satellite systems kept constant watch, their algorithms programmed to detect the bright flash of a launch anywhere on Earth. And yet, even amid this tense stability, accidents and misunderstandings nearly triggered disaster. Faulty computer chips sent false alarms of incoming missiles. Radar systems mistook sunlight reflections for nuclear launches. On one autumn night in 1983, Soviet officer Stanislav Petrov saw warning lights indicating that American missiles were inbound. He hesitated, trusting intuition over protocol, and chose not to report the alert. He was right. It had been a malfunction. His decision may have saved the planet. The morality of the bomb. As arsenals expanded, so did public unease. The anti-nuclear movement grew across continents, scientists, activists, and ordinary citizens marching beneath banners reading "Ban the Bomb." Films and books captured the dread: mushroom clouds on the horizon, silent winters beneath radioactive snow. The world had learned how to end itself, and now it was learning how to live with that knowledge. The moral argument against nuclear weapons was no longer confined to pacifists. Even generals admitted that any true nuclear exchange would be unwinnable. The concept of nuclear winter, developed in the 1980s, showed that soot from burning cities could block sunlight and plunge the world into freezing darkness. The survivors would envy the dead. Still, deterrent persisted, a doctrine built on logic but haunted by human fallibility. Nations justified their weapons as shields, even while knowing that one miscalculation, one malfunction, or one madman could bring about the end. The legacy of fragile peace. By the late 20th century, the nuclear age had stabilized into an uneasy equilibrium. Treaties like START, INF, and Comprehensive Test Ban sought to freeze the arms race. The superpowers began dismantling older warheads, though thousands remained. The Cold War ended, but the weapons did not vanish. They lingered, locked away in silos and submarines, a silent inheritance. The world had learned how to coexist with its own extinction. The red phones gathered dust, but the codes remained active, the keys still turned by living hands. Today, the descendants of those first bombs lie dormant in bunkers, guarded by soldiers who were not yet born when the Cold War ended. The deterrent still holds, but so does the danger. The nuclear shadow remains, stretching quietly across generations, a reminder that peace is never permanent, and knowledge cannot be unmade. The world emerged from the Cold War without fire, but not without scars. For decades, humanity had lived under the shadow of the mushroom cloud, and now it found itself face to face with a quieter danger, one born not of deliberate war, but of human error, decaying systems, and ambition unbound. The atomic age was entering its second phase, a world struggling to control the technology it could never forget. Accidents waiting to happen. Even before the end of the Cold War, nuclear power, the peaceful sibling of nuclear weapons, had begun to show its fragility. While the splitting of atoms could light cities, it demanded flawless precision and unrelenting vigilance. The smallest mistake could unleash invisible catastrophe. In March 1979, at 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania, a cooling valve stuck open. The failure of a simple mechanical component spiraled into a partial reactor meltdown. Though containment held and casualties were avoided, the event shook public faith in nuclear energy. Television images of steam rising from the plant's domes became symbols of mistrust, reminders that human hands, not just bombs, could lose control of the atom. But it was April 26, 1986, that etched terror into the world's memory. Deep inside reactor number 4 of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Ukraine, an ill-conceived safety test triggered an uncontrolled reaction. The reactor exploded, blasting its 2,000-ton lid into the air and spewing radioactive fire across Europe. Firefighters rushed in without protection, unaware that they were running into death itself. Within hours, radiation levels soared to thousands of times above safe limits. The nearby city of Pripyat, once home to 50,000 people, was evacuated in haste. Its amusement park, prepared for May Day celebrations, never opened. Today, its rusting Ferris wheel stands silent beneath encroaching forests, a monument to hubris and human cost. The disaster spread radioactive clouds across borders, poisoning soil and rivers, and leaving behind a zone of exclusion larger than some nations. Chernobyl revealed the dark symmetry between nuclear power and nuclear weapons. Both harnessed the same forces, both could erase entire regions, and both relied on fallible human systems to keep apocalypse at bay. The fall of the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the world feared a different kind of meltdown, one of control. Scattered across the newly independent republics were thousands of nuclear warheads, missiles, and materials. The Soviet command structure dissolved almost overnight, leaving scientists unpaid and storage sites unsecured. The question haunted every intelligence agency on Earth: who now controls the bomb? In the years that followed, international efforts scrambled to prevent catastrophe. The Non-Lugar Cooperative Threat Reduction Program sought to secure and dismantle leftover weapons, paying Russian technicians to decommission missiles instead of selling their expertise abroad. Even so, reports emerged of missing fissile material, enough, some feared, for dozens of small nuclear devices. The phrase "loose nukes" became shorthand for humanity's most terrifying treasure hunt. The Cold War had ended without nuclear war, but peace came with the constant anxiety that chaos, corruption, or terrorism might light the next fire. Modern echoes of the atom. By the early 2000s, the nuclear landscape had shifted again. New powers had entered the stage. India and Pakistan tested their bombs within days of each other in 1998, their detonations shaking both the Himalayas and the fragile balance of global stability. North Korea, after years of secret enrichment, announced its own successful tests in the following decades, defying sanctions and deepening isolation. Elsewhere, the pursuit of nuclear energy continued. Dozens of nations operated reactors to power their cities, each claiming peaceful intent. Yet the line between reactor and weapon remained thin. Uranium enrichment, plutonium reprocessing, technologies of light and shadow. Every centrifuge could serve two masters. In 2011, the Fukushima Daiichi disaster in Japan echoed the old lessons of Chernobyl. A massive earthquake and tsunami crippled the plant's cooling systems, leading to hydrogen explosions and radioactive leaks. While far less deadly, it revealed the same truth: no system is truly invincible when nature itself rebels. A world of invisible tension. Today, more than 13,000 nuclear weapons remain on Earth, scattered across 9 nations. Many are old, held in silos built during the Cold War, but some are newly modernized, equipped with AI-assisted targeting and hypersonic delivery systems. The bombs themselves are smaller, smarter, deadlier. Meanwhile, treaties once designed to hold back the tide have begun to fray. The INF Treaty collapsed. The Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty has yet to fully enter into force. Strategic arms reduction agreements teeter with every change in leadership. The language of deterrence has returned to headlines, and with it, the old unease. Yet amid this, ordinary life goes on. Cities hum with electricity, some of it drawn from nuclear reactors. Satellites orbit overhead, powered by plutonium cores. Scientists study radiation not as a weapon, but as a tool for medicine and space exploration. Humanity, paradoxically, thrives within the same physics that could end it. Lessons etched in stone. At sites like Hiroshima, Chernobyl, and Semipalatinsk, memorials rise from the earth, museums, stone monoliths, and silent craters left untouched. In the Nevada desert, engineers have proposed warning markers meant to last 10,000 years, carved with symbols to frighten future civilizations away from buried waste. The inscriptions are chilling in their simplicity. This place is not a place of honor. Nothing valued is here. The nuclear age has given humanity miracles and nightmares in equal measure. It has powered spacecraft to the edges of the solar system and erased entire cities from maps. It has cured diseases and created shadows burned into concrete. Every reactor hums with potential, every warhead sleeps beneath the illusion of control. The story of nuclear power, both weapon and tool, is not yet over. It is written daily, in the quiet vigilance of scientists, soldiers, and policymakers who guard against the same fire their predecessors once unleashed. And somewhere, beneath layers of history and dust, the atom waits, silent, neutral, eternal, indifferent to whether it illuminates the world or burns it to ash. The 21st century dawned with contradictions blazing like twin suns. Humanity had never been more connected, more informed, or more technologically advanced, and yet the same power that once leveled Hiroshima still lingered beneath mountains and oceans, waiting for a human decision or a human error. The question that haunted physicists in 1945, "What have we done?" now evolved into another, "What will we do next?" The dream of the star. Even as nations maintained their arsenals, scientists continued to chase the dream of fusion, the process that powers the stars themselves. Unlike fission, which splits heavy atoms, fusion joins light atoms, hydrogen into helium, releasing far greater energy with almost no long-lived radioactive waste. It is, in principle, the same reaction that fuels the hydrogen bomb, but tamed, slowed, and contained. Across the globe, laboratories turned from destruction to creation. In France, the colossal ITER project rose from the countryside, a donut-shaped machine called a tokamak, designed to hold plasma hotter than the sun inside magnetic fields strong enough to bend light. The goal, to achieve a net gain in energy, where fusion yields more power than it consumes. In the United States, Britain, and Japan, smaller reactors experimented with inertial confinement, firing lasers into tiny fuel pellets to mimic a miniature sun. In 2022, scientists at the National Ignition Facility achieved a historic moment, ignition, where the fusion reaction briefly produced more energy than the lasers put in. It was not yet a practical power source, but it was proof that the dream of clean, limitless energy was no longer a fantasy. The irony was impossible to ignore. Humanity, once defined by its ability to destroy with atomic fire, now sought salvation through the same physics. The atom had not changed, only the intention behind it. Shadows of the arsenal. While fusion promised light, the old arsenals refused to die. As geopolitical rivalries re-emerged, so did nuclear rhetoric. Nations modernized warheads, fitted them with precision guidance, and boasted of tactical nukes, smaller, supposedly more usable versions. What had once been unthinkable began to sound possible again. The digital revolution introduced new dangers. Missile warning systems now relied on satellites, sensors, and artificial intelligence. Algorithms could detect launches within seconds, but could also misinterpret data just as quickly. The human safeguard that once saved the world, hesitation, was slowly being replaced by automation. In underground bunkers, technicians monitored screens that might someday decide the fate of continents. The question no longer was whether humanity could destroy itself, but whether it would recognize the warning signs in time to stop the machines it had built to protect it. Disarmament and hope. Despite the tension, voices of reason persisted. The United Nations continued to push for non-proliferation and transparency. In 2017, over 100 nations adopted the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, a document declaring that the possession or use of nuclear weapons was illegal under international law. The nuclear powers did not sign, but the treaty symbolized something larger, moral momentum. Grassroots movements, from Tokyo to Oslo, grew louder. Survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki shared their stories with new generations, their frail voices bridging the decades. Scientists who once worked on weapons now campaigned for disarmament, haunted by the ghosts of their equations. And amid political gridlock, something remarkable happened. For decades, no nuclear weapon was used in conflict. The silence itself became a fragile form of victory. Lessons from the atom. The story of nuclear power, of splitting and fusing, of light and shadow, is ultimately a mirror of humanity's own dual nature. The same intelligence that harnessed the forces of the universe also unleashed them on its own kind. The same curiosity that built weapons of annihilation also created technologies that cure, connect, and sustain life. Every advance carries its reflection. Fission destroyed cities but now power submarines, hospitals, and spacecraft. Fusion lit hydrogen bombs but now glows with the promise of endless clean energy. Radiation once feared as poison is now used to fight cancer and sterilize food. The atom has no morality. It obeys only laws of physics. It is humanity that must decide what those laws will serve. 1,000 tomorrows. In laboratories and think tanks, new generations of scientists ponder how to make nuclear power truly safe, how to store waste for millennia, how to design reactors that shut down automatically, how to prevent the mistakes of Chernobyl and Fukushima. At the same time, diplomats and activists fight to ensure that the nuclear sword, now sheathed, never again leaves its scabbard. Perhaps someday, fusion will fulfill its promise and the atom's legacy will shift fully from destruction to creation. Perhaps the bunkers will empty, the silos crumble, and the warheads be dismantled into memory. Or perhaps not. The future remains suspended, like a particle in quantum uncertainty, between light and darkness. But there is reason for hope. Each decade that passes without a nuclear war is a silent triumph of restraint. Each experiment that brings us closer to sustainable fusion is a step toward redemption. And each generation that learns the lessons of Hiroshima ensures that the fire will remain contained within the stars, where it belongs. If the story of nuclear power has taught the world anything, it is that knowledge is eternal, but wisdom must be renewed. The atom is neither enemy nor ally, it is a mirror, reflecting our intentions with perfect clarity. One day, when historians look back on the age of the bomb, they may see not just fear and destruction, but a civilization that stood at the edge of its own extinction and chose, however imperfectly, to step back. And perhaps then, the phrase "splitting the atom" will no longer evoke terror, but the moment when humanity finally learned to hold fire in its hands without being burned. The end.